to deep inside of me, where the sky meets and the sea. Heartbeats blend with oceans roar, seeking depth I can't ignore. Shells and sand beneath my toes, tides reveal what ebb and flows. In the quiet still I hear whispered longings crystal clear. Deep calls to deep inside of me, where the sky meets and the sea. Heartbeats blend with oceans roar, seeking depth I can't ignore. Shows a mirror, soul's desire, burning with a holy fire. Depth of love beyond all dreams, in the vastness it redeems.
All right. Good morning, everybody. I'm still messing with camera angles. I got a new monitor set up over Christmas break. And so the way I had my stuff all set up, so it almost kind of worked. Now it doesn't work. And so I'm still fiddling with it. Somebody messaged me after my thing on Soteriology 101 last week saying, dude, you need like lighting. And I'm like, okay. Okay, no problem. I don't know how to do that. If you know how to do that, message me, and I would love to get some help with that because I'm a scholar, not a producer, so I have no clue.
You just open a curtain. That's where you get the light from. You just open a curtain.
Well, to do that, I would have to open the garage door, and it's 37 degrees here at my house. So, because to have a space for all of my schoolwork and everything, we converted half of the garage. And so my office space used to be the garage. So I don't have windows. I have a giant retractable window, but it gets cold when it's 37 degrees outside. So
a little breezy.
Like it does. So anyway, that's totally random that nobody cares about that I'm in the garage. So we're just going to keep moving on to welcome everybody to A Deep Calls Deep. Someday I'm going to figure out what I'm doing around here and we'll actually make this work. All right. Unfortunately, Leighton Flowers was supposed to be here, and then somebody scheduled his trip without asking him about his schedule first. And then Warren was supposed to be here, and life happens to people. So it is the three of us who are going to soldier on and have an amazing conversation about this and not have all of the I don't know, whatever it is that was going to happen with that. But so it's still going to be a good one, even though Leighton, Warren, and also Will was complaining about being busy and couldn't come either. So we are going to do this, and it's going to be awesome. So two of my absolute favorite regulars are here with me again. I just love it when these two agree to do anything on my channel because it's always great, good stuff when they're here. So, Spencer, we are here for yet another How to Read the Hard Parts of the Bible. And we are going to tackle a tricky one today because this one, I think, is becoming one of those things that I just can't not ignore anymore. Like, I stepped out of the soteriology wars for a long time because I didn't want to deal with all of it, but I now deal with so much of the emotional side of it now in the pieces of the stuff that I'm doing that I want to talk about how that makes this hard to read. So, and then Mr. Joshua Davidson, the master of storytelling and everything else. I just love these two guys a lot. So I'm glad you're here. So go ahead, and for anybody who hasn't seen you before, give yourself some introductions, and then we will dive into the deep end of this swamp of a dumpster fire.
Deep end. I see what you did. So I am Spencer Owen. I am a licensed therapist who works out in Colorado Springs, and I work primarily with trauma and specifically with people who have experienced spiritual trauma and religious abuse and other forms of church hurt or moral injury. And that is my professional specialty. And so, as a kind of supplement and support to that, I started up a podcast called the Trauma Informed Church Kid. And what we're doing is we're kind of walking through the scriptures from start to wherever I decide to stop. um, and and right now we are in Leviticus, and so we're going through Exodus and Leviticus, and we kind of have numbers in the background as we do that. But the whole idea there is to re-engage the Bible with a trauma-informed lens. So something that is not trying to rewrite what the Bible already says, but to uncover some of the trauma-informed dimensions of the Bible that perhaps have been obscured by ways in which it has been used in the exact opposite direction, as well as just, the accumulated accretion of all the centuries of our, understanding. So yeah, that's me. That's what I do.
Deborah's a fan too.
That's good.
She certainly is. She's very vocal about being a huge fan of Spencer, for sure.
That's great. Glory to God for all things.
Yeah, absolutely. My name's Josh Davidson. I've been here before, but I'm one of the founders of the Faith Unaltered channel and a host of the Cosmic Corner segment on the Faith Unaltered channel. And I am the honorary nerd layman friend. I am not in any way a terribly educated person. I am just blessed by the Lord with a fury of interests and desire to see and to know and an affinity for patterns. And so scripture happens to be something that calls very loudly to a person like me. And I'm pleased to know the Lord and to serve him. And what he has me doing is, pursuit of truth in the word through story and storytelling. And so that's pretty much where I'm coming from. If that's something that you enjoy, then check out Cosmic Corner or other episodes of Amber's show where I've been on here, and maybe you'll see some of the stuff that I'm talking about. But that's pretty much where I'm coming from.
Joshua Davidson is probably one of the few very true Renaissance men that I know who is actually a polymath that can talk intelligently about just about everything. And Spencer's probably the other one. And so, I'm like, who better for this than these two geniuses of everything? I love it. I learn stuff about all kinds of random weird stuff from these two all the time. In addition to the stuff that they know, everything else is just, I love these two a lot. They're just amazing, and I'm blessed by both of them. So if we haven't specifically, well, like Spencer kind of did, but today we are talking about another episode of how to read the hard parts of the Bible. But this time we're doing something different because Spencer and I have walked through several parts in the Bible itself that are hard to read and hard to deal with. And I would encourage you to go back and look at those because we've covered some pretty good stuff there. But this time we are going to talk about what happens when you take a particular theology and put it onto the Bible, and how does that make the Bible hard to read when you do that. And we and I, because this is my channel and I made the decision on this, I decided that we are going to single out Calvinism because I think that is one of the worst about theological frameworks for making the Bible hard to read. And we're going to go through and talk about that and the impact of what that does. And because I think, and just the people that I interact with, both in my church context and dealing with people there, and the people who contact me through those episodes that Spencer and I did, I would say that probably 95% of them have been injured by Calvinism in some form. And so I don't normally come out and say this is a terrible thing and we're going to talk about why this particular theology is a terrible thing. but this time we're going to, because it's important and it matters.
And the tendrils go far beyond just simply, you know, people who ascribe to the TULIP acronym. So there's like I myself have never grown up in a Calvinist denomination. My tradition is all very Wesleyan Arminian, but I have absolutely been impacted by that perspective and that reading on the Bible, and it shares a lot of presuppositions with a lot of the ways in which the Arminian evangelical world kind of sees things too. So it's much more than just that.
Yeah, the roots of it, like Josh and I were talking beforehand, that this is like, you know, up here in the Pacific Northwest, we have a lot of like raspberries and blackberry like bushes everywhere. And in certain parts of Western Washington, they have done the highway and freeway decoration with something that's called Scotch broom. And those three plants, once you put those in the ground, it's almost impossible to get rid of them. Like you have to, like literally around here, you could actually make good money in the Portland metro area with a few goats. And if you take those to people who are trying to eradicate those bushes out of their yards, people will pay big money to bring your goats over, because that's about the only way to get rid of them, is to completely demolish the dirt and then have to start over, pulling out the weeds. And if you leave even one little piece of root there, within weeks you've got a whole nother infestation. So that's just kind of what this feels like. And it's, you know, Calvinism and TULIP has been Mary Poppins sugar coated to go down in a lot of other vehicles of a lot of other thought that, you know, people don't realize. Like the church that I left would talk about they're non-denominational. They don't have a position on, they're not Calvinists, they're not this, they're not that. But as I was listening to them, you know, they're teaching and quoting Calvinist scholars all the time. They were supported by organizations funded by places like Acts 29 and Ligonier Ministries. And all of the curriculum that they were using was infused with all of this stuff. That, which, you know, I get pushed back sometimes when I'm talking to people and they'll quote, you know, John MacArthur or R.C. Sproul or whoever. And I'm like, don't even touch that stuff unless you have got a very sophisticated system to be able to sort out what's the good and what's the not. Just don't even touch it, because some of it is so coded, you could get infected with it and not even realize it.
Yeah, or they'll do like a quick YouTube search about like, or sorry, a Google search about a question they have, like, you know, what does this passage mean? Why is this kind of thing said? What is this doctrine that people talk about? And then they'll get like the top results are things like gotquestions.org.
Got questions, yep.
Or something from like the Gospel Coalition, or 9 Marks, or Together for the Gospel, or, you know, all these other sort of things that have deeply Calvinistic influences. And again, this is not at all to say that, like, you know, you're going to see a banner saying we believe in TULIP, you know, floating over top. It's not going to say that, but it will. But all the presuppositions will be there and will be intact, and they will then inform everything about all the answers that you get. So.
Yeah, it just really gets to be, and it's the machine of the publishing world, both in print and online, has become so good at stealth Calvinism and, you know, softening it enough to make it palatable enough that if you're not finely tuned to the language and what that means when they say that particular phrase, if you're not attuned to listening for it, all of a sudden you're, you know, which is why, and I'm, you know, this is one of the reasons why I really, really, really discourage people from listening to people like Gavin Ortland. Like, don't do it. The guy is slick, and it's sugar making bad pill and bad medicine go down. Nothing against Gavin Ortland. I'm sure he's a very nice person. But what he's soft pedaling in niceness is emotionally damaging and toxic to people. So
Well, I've even encountered it with like my daughter goes through the Awanas program at our church, and they obviously, they have their own little booklets that, give a presentation of the gospel and walk through certain biblical stories and describe them in certain ways. And it's very common, actually, that I have to go, okay, well, so this is what they're saying, and this is how you should answer the question they're posing because of the way they're looking at it. But let me tell you something different. Let me read this to you in a little bit different way. And yeah, I don't like using the term indoctrination for a whole host of reasons, but it is something that comes really close to that you have to be very conscious of and kind of keep a very, very close eye on, or else it just gets snuck in as if it is the gospel, the truth, the Bible, and without any kind of critical evaluation.
So the thing we're most concerned about around here is what that does to the story of the narrative and the character of God. Because if you don't get those things in the way that you have a healthy interaction with those, it really can be emotionally destructive. And Spencer, we're going to have you talk about that a little bit later when we get some more into that later on down the road, because the implications of reading scripture that way can be devastating to people. So we're going to start our crawl here and doing it through the narrative, which is what we do around here, because I love the narrative, and anybody will tell you that is what I love to do.
Whoa. What?
And there's a couple of our friends, Spencer being one of them, who has sat through a session with me getting his canonical narratives put in order a little bit. So it is a fun process, and I think that the narrative, there's so much power in narrative because we are narrative, and narrative is how we experience God. And so using narrative to fight back on bad theology is a very powerful tool. So that's what we're going to do. And we're going to go to probably my favorite section of, my favorite section of scripture. I mean, my thesis is pulling me to Baruch, but I still, it matters. It all matters. So we're going to start with the Exodus, because I think Exodus through Judges is a really good place for us to go for this conversation in particular. So going back, we're looking at the Exodus narrative. We ended Genesis with people who had taken refuge from a famine, and God brought them there for protection. And you see that through Joseph and his living out of being blessed by God, that all of Egypt is also blessed by God. And so they are enjoying the if-then blessings of the faithfulness of God's people. Exodus starts with a very interesting thing where they take note that they had the pharaohs had forgotten Joseph, which is true. But what that is actually a bigger statement is that they had forgotten the blessings of Joseph's God. So they were back on their own, making their own, doing their own thing, and forgotten God, which is a pattern that started in Genesis 3 that we have been seeing over and over and over throughout the narrative. And this is starting to not go well for God's people, because now they've been enslaved. And in the ancient Near East mind, they don't make a separation between the body and the mind and the soul. And so when they're saying that these people are in bondage, they're saying their entire person. So they don't have an agency to make a choice. They don't have an agency. The only thing that they get to do is survive based on the fact that they get fed enough to continue working to serve Egypt. And that's about the totality of their existence. So by the time we get to the Exodus narrative and God hears them groaning out for relief from this bondage, God sends Moses and Aaron, and we have the battle of the pantheons. And God not only just completely demolishes the Egyptian pantheon, he buys back the agency and the personhood of Israel as he brings them out of the land. And so here we are on the other side of the Reed Sea, and Moses sings a very long song, and Miriam gets out her tambourines and starts dancing, and everybody's celebrating because we've been released from bondage. But have we really? Is the very interesting question that's kind of left hanging there. So he takes them on out to Sinai, sets them apart, calls them holy, and then gives them the instructions for how to live as his people. And they don't even get through the whole giving of the instructions. And now we've got, golden calves and all kinds of craziness breaking out in the camp underneath, because they don't have an agency. And so to them, without a dictated existence, I'm not sure what to do. I need a dictated existence. So I need something to look at, to focus, to tell me how to exist. So they build a golden calf, because they still don't have the mechanisms in place to reestablish the liturgical rhythm that was established in the book of Genesis. So they have to get reintroduced to the Sabbath. They have to get reintroduced to how to live on the provision and the dependence on God, instead of a controlled response that's very Pavlovian, that they don't have any control over. And so I'm going to pause right there. And Josh, do you have any narrative observations? And then I'm going to throw it to Spencer to really talk about the mechanics of what's happening here.
For as far as narrative, the first observation I would make is that when Joseph comes to Egypt, he doesn't come as an honorary guest. He, in fact, comes as a slave. That's when he arrived there, was as a slave, and he was converted from a slave to a heightened agency. So that actually is Joseph's story individually, before Israel has the same story corporately. And so when we arrive in Exodus, we're having an echo of what happened to Joseph personally. And so you can already see that the pattern is let's say expanding outward. It's growing, right? And so it's the same type of thing happening on a different level of resolution, right? And what should have happened in the case of Pharaoh and Israel is something that did happen in the case of Joseph, which is Joseph was acknowledged as the virtuous man blessed by God. The God of Joseph is praised because Joseph is a wise man. He sees visions. He is, in fact, a blessing to the nation that he came to. And in being a blessing, the nation was blessed. Right? From there, Egypt and Israel both flourished until Egypt noticed that the people of Israel were becoming too numerous, and they decided that control was what was necessary, rather than let's say the fact that they didn't look at Israel and say, man, their God is powerful and they're seriously blessed. How do we get in on this? Instead, it was, how do we control this? How do we use it to our advantage? Right? And then the thing that happens from there is, as you said, God confronts the tyranny of Egypt and then moves them out, and they go through the waters, right? And this is something that we can see symbolized elsewhere in Scripture many, many different times. This is not the only time that they go through water either. They do it later on in order to get out of the wilderness and into the promised land. But the thing to notice is that even when God pulled them out of slavery and tyranny, what they reached immediately was not perfection and promise. What they reached was the wilderness, right? And what that wilderness should have taken them, perhaps at like a month or something to cross the wilderness and reach the promised land. But because of their disobedience, that process was strenuously extended, right? And so it's not the case that when you come out of tyranny and you're freed from tyranny, that you're all of the sudden just fine. What you left is an excess of order, and you're dropped into an excess of chaos, right? And so that's where all of, like you said, they don't have an identity. They don't have a pillar at the center of the earth to inform what it is that they are to one another and to God. right? They don't have a law, they don't have a temple, they don't have any of these things that we now can see on a convenient side of history would have made a lot of sense for them to comply in those ways. They simply didn't have any of that. What they had was the promise of God and the guidance of God. And us in our piety would like nothing more than to just be in that situation. Just give me God, just give me the guidance, just give me the Spirit. Not realizing that what you're asking for is in fact the lack of everything that made all of those things coherent and cogent and livable on the ground floor where they actually were, right? And so they had a huge gap. They left Egypt and nothing was filled. Everything was emptied. And so God, we know who that is behind the scenes. God is working with Israel, but a very void and formless Israel. Very much echoing the beginning of Genesis when God begins to construct something from what's there presently, but the thing is empty and unformed. It's ambiguous, you know what I mean? And so we are seeing a lot of the same patterns reemerge, but they're doing so in really clever, almost graduated sort of ways, because it's moving from the individual to the corporate back to the individual. Because even looking at Moses's life, we can see some of these patterns reemerging. He himself came from the water in order to be freed from the threat of death and so forth. And so on the largest level and on the smallest level, these patterns are recurring. And what they're showing is that the freedom from the threat of death's tyranny, the pathway through that is a willful undergoing the death of going through the water and coming out on the other side, not to perfection, but to a time of testing and service, right? And so that's something that informs a lot of what it is that we're seeing throughout the rest of the narrative, even throughout the whole Old Testament. And this is something that in itself is at odds with most of what Calvinism thinks salvation and the gospel actually is. According to Calvinism, salvation and the gospel is something that God does, full stop. It's not something that you do. It's something that happens to you, right? It's not an action you
or
perform,
not.
right? It's not or not. Yeah, it either happens to you or it doesn't, right? And so it's kind of like a sneeze. Either you sneeze or you don't. You didn't decide one day, I'm going to sneeze. The sneeze came upon you effectually and overpowered you. And irresistibly you sneeze. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And so it's very much like that. It's not giving you all the texture of God's investment. It's not giving you all the texture of man's failure. It not to the degree that we're talking about now. It does grant those pieces, but only as a landing platform for the assertion that it's something that God does.
So Spencer, as far as we are interacting with this part of the story and trying not to do that, what does the Calvinistic framework do for those of us trying to interact with agency and choice making and identity when it's stripped away?
Yeah, and that's really the way that the Reformed tradition, and I'm going to say that rather than Calvinism, just the Reformed tradition as a whole has seen the function of the law of God and the law that was given at Sinai. They see it as being this thing where humanity is deeply wicked and sinful, just very reprobate, and has no hope of any kind, and any errors of any kind, any infraction at all, is justly punishable by death. And so, and not just physical death, but like spiritual death, eternal death. And so as a result, God tries to step into there and say, okay, I'm going to tell you how I want you to live so that you will be able to avoid this outcome of physical death and ultimately spiritual death. However, in the Reformed tradition, the law is seen as being this impossible thing that nobody can keep, that it is utterly impossible, and people are incapable of keeping it because their hearts are so evil, because they're because of that core human problem that just discussed there. And so as a result, it becomes this, rather than being a gift of grace, it becomes this is why several Reformed people will look at like Paul's talk of pedagogos in Galatians, when it calls it a tutor, and it says, and they will look at that as being like a slave master, that the law was given to confine people, to like shut them up, to force them into this space because their wills are so sinful. This isn't a matter of like, he wants their free will, he wants their loving devotion, he wants anything like that. It's more like him saying, I know you cannot give that. So what I want you to do is at least do the right thing. And yes, I'm going to say things like, circumcise your hearts, and it has to come with a good heart. But ultimately, that's impossible for you. So I'm going to both put this impossible standard on you and also punish you to the utmost whenever you do fail it. And all of that is this extended millennial-long object lesson to prove to people that they can't keep the law, so that when Jesus comes, they can finally go, oh, thank goodness we don't have to do that anymore. Thank goodness we don't have to be suffering under this burden. Now, I'm sure other people will hear this and will say that's a caricature of Calvinism, which of course, you just don't understand Calvinism is the knee-jerk response of every Calvinist you talk to. But I would argue, and I'm not going to get into the defense of it, but I would argue that is exactly the entailment of the Reformation tradition. It's not necessarily what they explicitly say, but it is what people in the pews hear, and it is what they walk away with feeling about God and about his law and about his holiness and about his goodness and about all these other kind of things. You mentioned, or at least I mentioned the Gospel Coalition earlier. I actually found there's an essay on there about the law itself, and it talks about how it says the law of God is God's absolute demand on his moral creatures. As creator and Lord, God rightfully deserves and demands perfect obedience and loyal love from his moral creatures, both human and angelic. And in this context, the law of God refers to specific commands and demands on us. And this is after they talk about how, in light of sin, God's holiness stands against our sin. And holiness there is defined as moral perfection, which is already missing the mark. As scripture reminds us, his eyes are too pure to look on evil. He cannot tolerate wrong. And closely related to God's holiness and moral perfection is his wrath, i.e. his holy reaction to evil. Where the holy God confronts his creatures in their sin, there must be wrath and the full exercise of his justice and righteousness. So again, if anyone's going to say, like, I'm caricaturing, no, I'm drawing directly from the source here. But what that does is it causes us to see God as Father, as someone who sets us up to fail, as a way just to prove how good he is and how bad we are. And that causes in really, really deep rift and rupture. It's literally impossible to securely and safely attach to that kind of father figure or authority figure, because you're always seeing it as being, if I mess up at all, I'm damned. I'm done for. And of course, people in the Reformation tradition would say, yeah, that's the point. You were supposed to get that message. And that's why you're supposed to, the solution to that is, here comes Jesus. He takes the punishment. You don't have to worry about receiving that punishment anymore. And so that's okay. But then that causes this massive rift between God the Father, given the law, and God the Son, dealing with the consequences of the law. So all of this is just, it's layer upon layer upon layer piled upon that makes it this really unsafe, impossible, and by design impossible ability to create relationship with this person who we're supposed to have relationship with. And that's just that's just the intro.
Right. I just, so if I'm, so okay, help me out with this here, Spencer, because
Yes.
it sounds to me like you're saying that Reformed theology puts you in a cage because you're too evil to do anything on your own unsupervised, and you only get let out if God tells you that you can come out, and only if you do it the way that God tells you that you have to do it, and you have to put on the perfect performance theater, otherwise you have no value and you're not lovable no matter what.
Yes. Yes.
That's
Yep.
terrible.
Yes, it is.
Well, and to look at the other side of the coin, to be fair, the people who are proffering this idea aren't actually saying it that way. This is why it's so sneaky and very let's say attractive when stages something that says, don't you already see how wicked mankind is? Don't you agree with how broken things are? Don't you agree that you also are part of the problem? Don't I have a convenient answer to your hopelessness I just illumined to you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, in my last episode of my podcast that I just did, it was about the law and the law that was given at Sinai, and I talked about it exactly as you were describing it, Amber, as saying that God realized that His people were in this slavery mindset because they were coming from Egypt, and they were enslaved for several hundred years, and they don't know what it's like to have their own agency. And so if we look at the law in Sinai as being this thing that is just enslaving them again, and say, but now this time it's okay because it's to a holy God or something like that. That actually, like you were saying, Josh, it never gets presented as, oh yes, you are slaves of God, or you are slaves of His holiness or something like that. It's never presented in that way. However, I would actually argue that makes it much, much worse, because what winds up happening then is we wind up conflating and blurring what love and what not love looks like and is. And so, and we actually call things love that are deeply, deeply unloving and not at all what love actually is. And so there's a quote by N.T. Wright that I think is really, really good. I'm having a hard time finding it. I'll have to go looking for it. But anyway, basically he's saying that when we describe this kind of thing and then we call it love. Oh, here it is. It's from a book he wrote called The Day the Revolution Began. People who have grown up in a family with a violent, perhaps drunken father, or who have been abused one way or another by people in authority, hear someone in the pulpit telling the story of the angry God, the wrathful God I just described from the Gospel Coalition, and they think, I know that character, and I hate him. It doesn't do any good to tell people in that state of mind this angry God is really a loving God in disguise. If that's love, they think, then I don't want it. They have quite possibly been told by an abuser how much he, quote, loves them, or how much, and this is not an N.T. Wright's thing, but I'll say it, or how much they have made him respond this way. This is really their fault. They have brought this on themselves. All those things. Now, going back to N.T. Wright. You cannot rescue someone from the scars of an abusive upbringing by replaying the same narrative on a cosmic scale and mouthing the word love as you do so. So I would actually argue that by not saying the quiet part out loud, by saying, oh, it's really love, it's really grace, it's really goodness, you're making it much, much worse.
Let's continue down this road trip here with Exodus and jumping into Numbers, because we're gonna kind of jump over Leviticus, because this is the priest's manual of how do you teach people to get back into a liturgical rhythm and maintain a relationship with God. So we're gonna skip.
He
we're
went
gonna
full
jump
Muppet.
over Leviticus. We have 4 episodes. We have 4 episodes of Why Leviticus Matters, so we can take a pass this once, because it isn't as, I don't think, as quite relevant to what the point we're trying to make. So we'll skip it and give Spencer a great big weekend of therapy just to get over it. And now we're going to jump into the book of Numbers, right? So now we've gotten the priests back into the tabernacle. We're back into holy, clean space where we can be in relationship with God. And now we're ready to go on to take our spot in the promised land. But, I like to joke that Numbers is the 2 worst road trips in history, because it's really interesting if you're watching what's going on there. Because a lot of people, they look in their drive-by Sunday school learning of the book of Numbers about how people are so stupid and they just can't learn. So God has to keep punishing them by keep sending them back out into the wilderness because they're too stupid and sick to get it. But I think that really what we're seeing there, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that they're learning how to have personhood, how to have agency, how to have national identity, and to learn how to trust God, because they're out in the middle of nowhere in a world that lives at war, and there's all kinds of dangers everywhere, and their clothes don't wear out, their shoes don't wear out, they eat every day. They don't, we don't see mass outbreaks of sickness and death by animals and by attacking, the hobby-roo that are running around killing people all over the place. Like, they're protected, and they get there basically as far as we know, as intact as they did when they left from where they were in Egypt. They arrive to the promised land through the book of Numbers by God re-teaching them corporately and individually to undo bondage and to relearn how to have agency and trust. Am I reading that right, guys?
Well, I think it's similar to why it's the case that, God doesn't simply receive us unto himself in some sort of private rapture when you convert. Why is it that you're left here after the moment when you say yes to Christ, and you're brought into the family of God, and you begin a journey into the promise that God has for his people? Why is it that you don't drop right from there into a glorified body? Wouldn't that be compelling to your friends and neighbors? Obviously it would, right? But the question is, how then do you learn? What is the training ground? What's the quarry that chips off the broken edges so that there'll be no tool herd in the building of his temple in the end? Right? Like, what is it that creates that space for people to learn the ropes of participating in a divine life that doesn't end? There would be great need for getting them to learn how to participate prior to the eternal part of the divine life.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It makes sense to do things that way, but it is uncomfortable. And so we kick back against it. Because of our experiences being in that place, we lament not being able to bypass the difficulty and go right into the promise. And I think you're right about pointing out that the difficulty is actually part of the fulfillment of the promise, is that it is in fact refining and rebuilding and giving shape and function and form to the thing, right? I had pointed out earlier that Israel was parallel to the earth in the beginning of Genesis, that they were formless and rather void, that they didn't really have anything. They didn't even have land. They had nothing, right? Like, they were just exited from their tyranny, and they walked out into, a desert of abject poverty. And yet, even in that place, they're more provided for than most kingships were at that time. Right? Like you said, they didn't see any of the same difficulties that would have been the most obvious and most evident to a people stuck in a desert for 40 years. All of those things had been alleviated for them, right? And so it's interesting to note that despite the fact that they were not in the promise and they were in difficulty, God's provision was for them nonetheless, right? And so it is a place where people are learning and growing and receiving, but also feeling the weight of loss and feeling the hardship of toil and work and needing to learn sacrifice and needing to learn to be a blessing to the other, or even to receive blessing, or to honor authority, or any of the other things that God in fact wants to build into us as those virtues prior to taking us out of these bodies of death and putting us into glory, right? There, it's along the exact same lines, I think, is the reason why people don't, and it is kind of a lament, right? Like, it's not like I want to be here. If God took me and my family home all together, you know what I mean? Like, it'd be mournful for everybody who's left back, but what a treat. You know what I mean? Every time I know somebody who's a believer and their family member is a believer and that person passes away, it's like, how bittersweet. I'm so sorry that you get to remember their absence, but I am so blessed for that person. Right? Like, it really is both of those things. And so I don't think that it's lawful for God to bypass that process.
I think I would say one more thing, and then I'm going to let Spencer do his ninja thing on this, because I think that there's a little bit that's built into the Western American response that we have, whether you're pulling in the modern conversation of Augustinian ontology and original guilt idea, or just this Greek philosophy idea of the Gnostic, where the observable reality is corrupt and therefore must be escaped through mental ascension. We don't want to go through the process of sanctification or theosis, because that hurts. That's painful. And that to us feels wrong, because we don't want to suffer. And we are looking for the first rapture catapult out of here that we can, to get out of the suffering. But we don't learn the deep lessons of dependence that comes from actually incarnating with God in that suffering, to learn that total dependence that comes from working through that process in a slow, painful way of reliving wounds in the incarnation, where they're actually assumed and healed, instead of just raptured out. So I get to watch everybody else who didn't catch the rapture catapult suffer, so because I don't have to. So Spencer, please ninja away at this point.
Sure. So I mentioned my last podcast episode, we're talking about trying to get out of slavery mindset. And the title of the episode is From Slavery to Sonship, because that really is what God is trying to do by leading the people to Sinai, giving them the law, and then walking them through the wilderness. And then later on, even when they fail the faithfulness test, continuing to stay with them in the wilderness. He is helping them to heal those wounds that Egypt inflicted on them. And yes, that's very trauma informed. And that also is very human and very reasonable for us to like understand as a narrative, because as a trauma therapist, I see this all the time, where what we know about trauma is that it fundamentally affects our brain, literally on structural levels. Things like the amygdala and the hippocampus increase or shrink in size. There is increased neuron activity in certain regions with neutral stimuli that cause, fight or flight reaction. There's so many different like deep brain pre-volitional things that happen. And I see this happen all the time with my clients who've experienced trauma. They get stuck in this trauma wheel where, because they immediately react a certain way to something, they just kind of tend to respond out of that reaction without really thinking about it. But the problem is that reaction is a trauma reaction. And then when they respond with a trauma response to the trauma reaction, it just reinforces the trauma. And so that's one of the reasons why when these people who are Israelites, who have been pulled out of Egypt, pulled out of slavery, pulled out of hundreds of years of generational trauma, They have deep, deep, deep wounds and wiring that needs to be rewired and healed. That cannot happen through, or not cannot. God has chosen to not, by and large, make that happen through snap of the fingers, Thanos snap, now it's all gone. He has chosen to work with us, which again is another problem with Calvinism, because of the monergism. When you were talking, Josh, about that whole process of like growth and development and shaping, like that's a non sequitur in Calvinism, because it's God doing it all, and he can do it all whenever he feels like it. So why doesn't he? Why doesn't it happen right away? It doesn't make sense. Whereas if you have a more synergistic approach with two wills genuinely working together, human and divine, then we have the need for this process of slow healing, slow recovery, slow rewiring. And that is not something that can happen top down. It cannot, and I hear this happen all the time with people, where they talk about someone who has experienced trauma and they go, well, they just need to get out of the victim mindset. And I go, when's the last time you tried to change one of your fundamental mindsets? Like, honestly, how long did it take you? And did you just like hear a truth, hear someone speak something? Hey, you're not a victim. Oh my gosh. Well, okay, thank you. Now I know. Now I can just, all right. Like,
It's like telling a depressed person to feel better.
yes. Or, like me when my wife is angry at me, saying, hey, just calm down. That's a recipe for volcanic disaster. And not because of her, because of me, because that is me being a complete idiot and missing the reality of humans and how humans work. Humans do not just simply work on reason alone. We like to think we do, but really reason is the writer, and all the other deep brain stuff is the elephant. The rider and the elephant can work together to go in the right direction, and the elephant needs the rider to be able to, go in the right place. But the rider, reason, cannot force the elephant, the beast, to just do what it wants. It has to do that through a long process of building relationship, building connection, building attachment. And again, that's just impossible in the Calvinist, system, or in the Reformation system. So instead, what God tries to do is he tries to help his people learn how to stop being slaves and start being sons. And he does that through a very slow process of teaching them, first of all, here's what your inheritance is. Here's what I have planned for you and designed for you. Exodus 19:6. You will be to me a kingdom of priests, and a holy nation. And that is his vision. And then he goes about trying to craft them bit by bit, slow step by slow step, into the kind of people who can shed off the garment of Egypt and slavery and put on the garment of being sons, being heirs, being inheritors to that inheritance. Just like all trauma recovery, that is not a wave of a magic wand or a snap of the fingers. It has to happen bit by bit, step by step, with the cooperation of the other person. And yes, just like happens in Numbers, they will fail. They will do trauma things. They will have trauma responses. That is built in. That is not God saying, because you messed up, I'm going to be wrathful and I'm going to punish you. It's God saying, no, children. Okay. I know that you see this as the only way, to be afraid of these people because they're giants, but haven't I given you enough reason to trust me? Haven't I given you water at Horeb? Haven't I given you quail in the desert? Haven't I given you manna in the desert? Haven't I protected you from the Amalekites? Haven't I? Oh, okay. Clearly, you haven't gotten the message yet. So you need longer to get the message. So let's go in the desert. We'll go back. A whole generation is going to die out. Yes, but The reason why they have to die out is because there's something in their bodies, minds, souls that is just not able to receive this message. So I need to teach the next generation how to be sons. So please work with me.
This brings up a question for me actually here, Spencer, because I'm wondering about this, because I've been playing with this whole idea of the one generation having to die off for the new one to go in, as you were talking about that, because there's over and over and over and over again. They say, why did you bring us out here to starve? We want to go back to the meat pots. Why did you bring us out here to die? We want to go back where there was room for graves. Why did you bring us out here? So it sounds like the deprogramming is there. It's so deeply ingrained their fallback that anytime they reach something new and scary, I need to run back to where it feels safe because it's familiar. It's not safe, but it feels safe because it's familiar. And for some people, that's so deeply ingrained that doesn't even always get healed in this life. Sometimes it needs to be healed in the next one. And that Numbers is showing us that sometimes it takes more than one generation to heal a wound.
I think there's also something that's really relevant to this that kind of is existing in a really awkward elephant in the room sort of sense, where we're seeing an uptick of people who are trying to do the apologetics thing, but doing it by way of antagonism and, metaphorical slaps to the face, where they think, like, if I could just smack you hard enough, you'll wake up. Right. And people are doing this exact same thing in the political sphere. That's not quite as surprising, to be honest with you. Kind of always was like that. But now there's this newfound exhaustion for the fact that the only mode of operation and conversation that we can conceive of anymore is to smack you awake. And when that doesn't work, my exhaustion is to just go, fine, I won't talk to your stupid sleeping self anymore. Go ahead and stay asleep. And we're just apathetic and want to walk away. Thank God God's not like that. But I think that what Spencer was just laying out, why exposure is necessary to overcome what's happened. It's not merely smoothing the surfaces, right? It's actually digging out the undersoil and replacing it with good topsoil, right? And this you have to turn up all of everything has to get dug up, right? And this is similar to how you were talking, Amber, about, invasive plants and stuff like that, like rose bushes, ivy, blackberry bushes, all these kind of, if you don't get like a tiny piece of it left in the soil is sufficient, right? Enough time granted to that tiny piece and it will take over again, right? So the whole thing needs to be turned up. It needs to be upended, right? And that is deeply troubling. It is very uncomfortable to have that happen. It's very, very uncomfortable to have your worldview flipped on its head and hollowed out. It's even harder to have your actual living situation be flipped on its head and hollowed out. Both of those processes in concert together is very, very, very uncomfortable, very difficult. And so I don't think we're making small bones about this, but I would say this is one of the reasons why I caution so strongly against people that antagonism is not evangelization. Antagonism is not apologetics. And being brash is not the same thing as being bold, right? Being offensive is not the same thing as being outspoken.
Being truthful is not the same as being loving.
Right, exactly, yeah. And I was just talking, ironically, I was talking with Deborah about that the other day, and it's truth devoid of love will always end up trying to enforce itself tyrannically. But love without truth will always end up trying to manipulate things. And that's just how it is. And God's not a manipulator, and he's not a tyrant. And so we see the long drawn out process that we're describing here is one that if God in his sovereignty wanted to do the bragging rights thing that he is always described as being that character that needs to have overlord privileges or else his itch is not scratched, right? He needs to be able to display himself in the most glorious means possible. If that was the case, then most of what happens in that story is entirely needless window dressing, right? It's so difficult to try to look at that series of events and say, Yeah, this was a display of the power of the sovereign God in the Calvinistic sense, right? In terms of how we would view the word sovereignty as highest authority and greatest prerogative, God is exactly that. And in his highest authority and greatest prerogative has chosen to do exactly this. And so God is sovereign, God elects, God determines some things. All of that is sound. But what he does and how he does it is very, very telling.
About his
And
character.
yeah, it's about protecting the character of God. And I want to just say, like, when I was talking on Leighton's channel on Friday, we kind of got into this a little bit because, you know, we get this idea. All of us are wanting to protect the idea of the sovereignty of God. We all want to protect the idea that God is given glory by and worship through what we do, and that we are a reflection back to God. But to say that because I don't live out a predetermined script, or if I make an independent choice, and that all of a sudden I have gone off of God's plan and violated all of the secret will things that are going on there. I don't even know. I don't even try anymore to figure that whole maze of wills out. You know, that if I do one thing and I knock over something off my desk that was supposed to be planned by God to sit on my desk for 3 more weeks, that somehow that is diminishing God's sovereignty or God's glory, then I'm sorry, but you have a very small God. That if what I do can take anything away from God itself, then your definition of God is too small
and insecure.
Yeah, because God that is big enough for the creation and the cosmos is not going to get upset if I say, you know what, God, you want to give me that blessing, but no, thank you. I'm going to go over here and make my own mess. Is not going to diminish God in any way at all. It's just going to harm me until I become the prodigal son who says, yeah, God, that was a bad idea. I want to come back. And God says, right, you want to come back? I'm going to come running to meet you.
Yeah.
That's
I'm
sovereignty.
gonna. Yeah. Right. Exactly. And I'm gonna tell him myself here, because I did a little bit in my last episode about slavery to sonship, because I talked some about the Dr. Dobson effect and how the Dr. Dobson way of parenting, because, you know, we're talking about trying to train them into being sons. Okay, that's parenting. The Dr. Dobson way of parenting was built on this view of God as being this implacable, perfect holiness, and requires to smack back into line anybody who steps out, and creates this cage to make sure they can't step out and all that stuff. Because explicitly, the Dr. Dobson method was about breaking the will of the child. Like, that was exactly what it was designed to do explicitly, because wills are sinful in this method, and not just like somewhat, not just affected by sin, but deeply sinful, irremediably and impossible to choose good, sinful. And so that was a lot of what I was raised in. Now, I still, to this day, have deep problems with rewiring myself out of that. Even though I know good and well that's not true, that's not what God wants or is looking for, I still see the effects of that in the way that I handle disobedience from my daughter. Whenever something goes wrong, I still have really, really difficult time handling my emotional reaction. And I see that as being an effect of generational trauma and sinfulness that has been passed down from generation to generation. And even though I know in my head that's not correct and not true, I still have such a hard time with it. And my good friend and our good friend, Phil Bray, has just put up a video on his YouTube channel, Leviticus is Fun, where he talks about that very thing, where he said, you know, be holy as I am holy, but not like this, meaning the wrathful, angry God stuff. Because that is exactly what I was always taught, was that was love. That was true love, is having wrath at every sin, just like the Gospel Coalition article that I wrote, that I read, said, is like every single sin, God must emphasize, must have wrath, that kind of response to it. That approach creates sons, but it creates insecurely attached sons because the father himself is insecure. And frankly, like I said, telling on myself, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner, because that is still something I wrestle with deeply.
Yeah, somebody who grew up without a steady father figure. My mom got married when I was about 7 years old, and the guy she got married to, while he's the only dad I really ever had, was not prepared to be a father in any sense. Very emotionally distant person, rather a rager. Was spent 12 years in prison and was only 6 months out of prison when my mom married him, and so I had very little identity in this person. And I grew up kind of without a dad, without that kind of guidance. And growing up in a reformed and rather Calvinistic leaning theology, the only point of reference I had for dads was distant, emotionally unavailable, wrathful, impatient, and those kind of things. So the dissonance between the God that the Bible describes in some parts and the God that the Bible describes in other parts was very real for me, right? Now being a dad, I have to, in like that way, like Spencer's talking about, overcome the gaps, because in some sense it's very difficult to try to look at fatherhood and make it up as you go. And that's really what it feels like for somebody in a situation like mine. And I'm not trying to say pity me. I'm just looking at it reasonably. It's not a mystery to me anymore on this side of my own history, looking at my life and seeing by the time I was 14 until the time I was probably about 19, 20-ish, I was deeply troubled and I was very depressed. And I still suffer from depression on and off. It happens. It's something that, you continually have bouts in overcoming, and it's a very difficult thing to deal with. I'm not minimizing it, but it was very severe during that time. And I had very little male influence. I had very little guidance in that sense. I was not approaching becoming a man. I was just getting older. And I actually disdained getting older because I didn't actually even enjoy being a child, but I sure didn't want to be a grown-up. Right. And so coming from that place and seeing that, I can say emotionally what happened on the ground floor of my experiences, having that kind of worldview. I went to church 5 days a week. I was heavily invested in the church. I was trying desperately to serve and to be a part of what it was that I was being told and being taught. And I was still rather deeply troubled, and even in a private sense, suicidal, right? And so it's very difficult to look at that and not see the fruit of what it is that we're talking about written all over it. And so fast forward 15-ish, 16 years, here I am. I'm an adult. I have children. I'm married. I'm not unsuccessful, right? But I still do face some of the exact same things, that creeping residue of hopelessness that'll always kind of taint some of the memories that I have of that time that are now being overcome because of the fact that God has given me a deep sense of meaning. God's given me a deep sense of purpose. God's blessed me with a family and a wife. He's giving me children, right? Like all of those things. And as a young person, not realizing what the meaning of life actually was even supposed to connote. I thought for me, how best does life serve me is how you answer that question. And I didn't realize that that's actually not even close to the right question, right? And seeing the way that Calvinism supports and illustrates a very pragmatic view of reality for God. Reality is nothing more than expression of the attributes God wanted to illumine about himself. And here you are, almost like a prop or a stage play, playing out what it is that God wanted to display to himself about himself, right? And you're just kind of caught in the middle of it. It does give you a rather hopeless and terrified feeling, and you are rather disjointed, and you're not there. You're a detached son, like Spencer was just talking about, right? Growing up in church and even getting a stepdad and still feeling spiritually like an orphan is one heck of a ride, you know? And so I'm very blessed, just full disclosure, I'm very blessed to be able to come out of that worldview, out of that mindset, and come into a place where now I'm openly trying to confront meaninglessness in other people's lives. That's honestly why the whole Cosmic Corner thing began. It's not just because I'm a nerd and I like it. Yeah, that's why it's fun. But the reason why it exists is, in fact, because I needed that really badly and it wasn't there. And so I'm hoping to fill that gap for even just one person. If you fill that gap, it really makes a difference. You know what I mean? It's like all of those things at once. It's very, very messy. But at the same time, it's again, no wonder to me that it ended up like that, and that I ended up thinking that way, and that I still have to confront myself continually when things like that happen. When I have like a low moment and a depressive fit or whatever it is that's going on, I have to be able to then submit that back to God and talk with somebody or talk myself through or whatever it is, and confront the thing. It's no longer about running. It's no longer about delaying the problem, right? Because that was what I was left with, is I'm supposed to be a follower of Christ who is the life. I'm supposed to be ready with an answer for hope. And hope seemed like something that like pastors have, you know, it's something that people with really radical testimonies have. But what about the little guy like me? I grew up in church. I don't have a radical testimony. I don't have that moment where I was saved out of the club life or came off of coke, or, you know, like had my life saved from a bank robbery or survived some crazy cancer or accident or some, you know, I don't have that. I don't have that story. And so it didn't seem to me that God was making a great display in the same ways. And so it was very questionable. It was very difficult.
I want to walk into my it's going to be a little hard for people to follow me here on this one. So just stay with me, because I think the antidote to this is the book of Deuteronomy. Now you're going to go, wait a second, because we're about to go into a whole nother retelling of the Torah, because I Spencer, I refuse to use the L word anymore when I'm talking about the Old Testament. I will not, because it confuses people for the Reformed theology tradition reason. So I have trained myself. We don't use that word. I don't use that word around here, and I don't like people using that word. It would cringe every time someone says that word. But we're going to talk about why Deuteronomy is the antidote for this, because Deuteronomy, I got to study Torah under Dr. Rebecca Josberger, who is a Deuteronomy scholar, and taught me everything I know about the ancient Near East mind and how to understand Torah. And when we got to Deuteronomy and turned in our reflection papers, she handed all of them back and said, no, Deuteronomy is a love letter from God. Go do these again. And I had to reread Deuteronomy 4 more times before I figured it out. And then I was like, wait, this is 959 ways that God is saying, I love you. Okay, so what's the significance of 959? Do either of you know, by the way, the significance of the 959 just off the top of your heads as a weird trivia fact? Nope. Okay. I wouldn't expect so. I would have been super impressed with your nerd level cards if you would have known that. There are 959 verses in the book of Deuteronomy. So that's why I like to say there's 959 ways that God's saying I love us, because that's what Deuteronomy is. Deuteronomy is a love letter from God. It's the last 5 sermons of a pastor who knows he's about to hand off his people to somebody else to take them home, because he doesn't get to do it with them. And God over and over and over is building in every possible device that he can. Don't forget me. I love you. Don't forget me. I love you. Here's why. And he's building it into the Shema, which isn't a list of tell your kids a checklist of rules. It is building reminders into every hashtag of their day and their life that sends their thoughts back to God, because it's contemplation of everything. And all of the instructions are, here are the ways that I'm going to contain the damage that you do to each other until you learn not to damage each other that way anymore, because I love you. And don't forget me and go chase after all the squirrel shiny things, because that's where you're going to get hurt. So stay and remember what I told you, and remember focused on me, because that's where your blessings, if you love me, you will be blessed. But if you forget me, you will have to pay the consequences for it. If then language in the instructions is built in there to remind them in everything, if you remember me, it's going to go well for you. And if you don't, God help you, I'll be there to fix the mess when you mess it up. So I think Deuteronomy is a corrective.
Mm-hmm. And throughout, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Mm-hmm. That's Deuteronomy 31.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. Which takes us to the book of Joshua and Judges. And I love these two in talking about this topic of sovereignty and election and free will and all of this stuff, because these two stories, because they're happening at the same time, when you put them together, they overlap like this. There's a little lag on one side and the other of those books, but basically those books happen pretty much at the same time. But there's several things going on there. But one of them is when God keeps his end of the relational covenant, Joshua happens. And when humans don't live up to their half of the relationship covenant, Judges happens. And so you've got this dynamic that plays out with God is showing us, look, when you do it the way that I love you and I told you to do it, this is cool and awesome and spiritual warfare, and it's just all kinds of cool. And if you don't, this is what's going to happen, and you're going to see one of the craziest trauma history families, like in the entire earth, that's playing out in the book of Judges, because you just keep wandering off, and you're just not remembering to do the showing up for your part of this relationship kind of thing that's going on there. So it's this beautiful interplay of not only God shows up and does God on spiritual warfare level clean out the land. He's like, I'm going to teach you how to live in the land with me like this. So you need to come help clean out the land with me. So there's some participation that's there. So there has to be, because we all know from every time we try to teach our kids something, if you just hand it to them and say, go do this, they don't learn it as well as if you do it with them. So when you do it together, you learn better, which is what Joshua is showing them, that I'm in it with you. Come do it with me. So everybody gets participation and buy-in. And this is a better way for you to learn. And it's just, there's Joshua can be hard to read, but, there's also Joshua starts with, most of the land was already vacant because the rest of the nations that were there saw Yahweh coming and went, and they left because they already knew who Yahweh was better than Israel did.
Yeah, and that's exactly what Yahweh says he will do in Exodus as well as Deuteronomy, where he says, I will send, it sometimes gets translated as hornet, ahead of you. But like the idea here is like a natural disaster, a plague, something like that will like push these people out. So God is not sitting here saying, okay, these people are the natives in the land and you are going to go commit divinely sanctioned genocide. He's saying, and that's going to be all good and okay. He's saying, no, look, like the message of who I am and what I did to Egypt, who opposed me and not just opposed me, like, how dare you oppose me, but like brutalize my child. Egypt brutalized my firstborn son. And you saw what I did to them. You don't want that to happen to you. And most of the nations got the message. The ones who didn't were the most fervently dug in their really heinous and egregious and awful practices of cannibalism and child sacrifice and all the giant clan stuff. And it's those practices that God says, this has to be, you can have no quarter with those practices, which honestly makes sense. Because if I knew that next door to me, I had a Satanist who was sacrificing children and drinking their blood and was doing all other kinds of demonic things, like I would not just go, oh, like live and let live. I would get the authorities involved. And in the ancient Near East world, the authorities were the gods. And that's exactly what happens.
Yeah, and I just love too, because there's also this really cool, funky thing that people don't realize that's going on with Joshua, because they're coming into the land, we're clearing out sacred space, and the tabernacle goes from only not just the physical tent in the middle of the camp, it expands to be a complete spiritual covering over this sacred space. So God's like, you're not just hanging around the tabernacle, you're now in the tabernacle. So it's like super cool because they get God's divine covering and God's divine blessing while they're participating with God's, God doing his end of the family covenant, showing up and providing and doing what he said he would do. And then the book of Judges, where God's people go, yeah, no, I like that thing over there. And they didn't clear out the land like they were supposed to. And they left some of that contagion and those temptations there. And they're like, ooh, that's cool. Let's try that. And God accepts the people's no and accepts their wandering off to go do their own thing. And one of the hard parts to understand about Judges is like, why does God do that? Because he knows what's going to happen. He knows because, people are people and he is God, that every time we say no and wander off, we're going to cry out and need rescued. And that's what the book of Judges is trying to help us understand, that when we decide to say no and go do our own thing, God lets us do that because there's a lesson waiting on the other end. But there's also a loving Father that the first time we cry out, God shows up immediately. Like it is, I am waiting to be invited because I'm not going to force you to let me rescue you. I'm not going to do it against your will because that's not loving. And I just love the book of Judges. I love the book of Judges.
No, and I have the same thing with my clients, where as a counselor, I am incredibly non-directional and non-directive. So what that means is I do a lot of like curious questions and exploration with them, rather than saying, okay, person, here is the healthy way. Here is the healthy way to respond. Here's the correct way. Do that and you'll be fine. And there's a whole host of reasons why I do it that way. Ethically, it's very bad idea to do it any other way. Because if I were just to say, here's the answer, go do it, then I take away their agency. And frankly, that is exactly what traumatized people have to deal with all the time. That's exactly how they got in that mess in the first place, is that their agency was taken away from them. And so I am in many ways re-traumatizing them. If I say, here is the right path, go follow it and you'll be fine. Instead of this like really clear statement of like, do X, go. Instead, it works so much better, so much slower, but also much deeper and much more respective of their personhood and identity. When I say, okay, let's talk about that. Let's understand a little bit more about the way in which your behavior that you've been doing as your best guess of how to solve this problem, how well has it served you? Where has it brought you to? What have you done as a result of that? And has it made your life closer to or further away from the thing you want, the way you want your life to be? And very often I will watch them do things like get into a relationship or make a certain choice with whatever. And I was sitting here and one half of my brain is going, bad idea. I know what's going to happen here. Now, do I not say anything? No, I still step in and say, I wonder if you were to do that, do you think this might happen? Is this something you think might be an outcome of that? I'll, gently point them in that direction. I won't just leave them alone, but I will like slowly try to pull them into seeing it through the eyes that I have, which are not necessarily correct, but they are eyes that are not filmed over with the trauma effects.
Mhm.
And so it helps to kind of have that second pair of eyes in there. But very often they still get into the relationship. They still jump in head first when I know they're going to drown. They still do all these things, and I watch it happen, and I empathize with them when the hurt happens, when the things fall apart. We pick up the pieces together and we figure out how can we learn from this and how can we do better next time. And yes, very often that means that at the end of the day, if they just would have listened, it would have been fine.
Right.
But it's unethical, it's arrogant, it's also just not practically effective to just simply tell them straight up, do this, stop. Because to do the whole, like, Bob Newhart, stop it, style of therapy. Because they have to change their mindset, not just their behavior. This is not propositional truth. This is participatory truth. They have to participate in that reality. In some cases, that is both the negative reality, the experiencing what it feels like to do the wrong thing and have things fall apart around them, and also experience of doing the right thing and feeling the joy and pride and freedom that comes from that. I cannot download that experience into their brains. I have to help them, walk with them into that space. And so when people say things like, well, why didn't God just clearly tell them to do X, Y, Z? It's because they do not understand human nature, quite frankly.
Well, God did tell them, but they forgot and went and did it their own way anyway.
Well, yes.
And so
yes.
it's even worse.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. When I answer in that way, I am ex hypothesi, just agreeing with the premise and saying, okay, let's say you're correct that was not clear. Here's why that still works. Having said that, though, you're absolutely right. There are plenty of times and places where God is abundantly clear to anyone with eyes to see and ears to hear.
So, Josh, I have a question for you about this, about the book of Judges, right? So if we're sitting back and looking at the book of Judges and saying this is free will on God's part and this is free will on man's part, but if God's sovereign, why is all this mess happening? I mean, if it's predetermined and God decides and picks my will for me, doesn't that make the book of Judges either redundant and completely unnecessary after chapter 1, or doesn't that turn, if we look at it and read it that way, then doesn't that turn God into a puppet master or a tyrant who is torturing people for his own sense of self-glorification or something?
Well, as far as the presumed motive would be his self-glorification, but you'd have to kind of question whether or not that was the only motive, because some of the things that are pulled off, not just in the book of Judges, but all throughout Scripture, the difficulty with the question of predetermination in Calvinism comes with trying to localize the question at all. If we just look at the book of Judges, there's lots of stuff that God could justify doing, right? But if we look beyond the book of Judges and see that they got there by way of God's design, they are there by way of God's design. What they do while there is God's design. What God does afterward is God's design. What others do to them afterward with God's withholding of his protection or what have you is also God's design. For that matter, Pharaoh's disobedience would be God's design. Their enslavement would be God's design. You see what I mean? There's so many things that's connected to, and a lot of people want to see the idea that God orchestrating all things has some level of comfort because we say this sentiment that God is in control. And fair enough, God has control. Does that mean God then is controlling? Because that's not quite the same thing, right? I think God had a grasp on the circumstance. That means that nothing that happened was beyond his aid or so, right? But in terms of Calvinism, and this is something that I even having conversations with Reformed people, they've conceded intentionally and even cautioned others away from using the idea of permission or allowance at all in the idea of Calvinism, right? The idea of a determined reality. And so in the narrative of Judges, I was going to say Jude, in the narrative of Judges, you have the, let's say, this almost pendulum swing back and forth between compliance and rebellion, right? And you have that movement, you have that play, that dance back and forth, is something that I think illustrates the fact that if God was going to script the entire event, his frustration is very ironic, right? It does.
How dare you do what I made you do?
Right? Yeah, exactly. And it's very difficult. It's kind of like being mad at a ball for falling downhill when you let go of it. It doesn't like there's no real cause to it, you know. I think that one of the key pieces of Judges that kind of illumines why it is the case that God is not simply being a tyrannical controller of their situation is in chapter 2 of Judges. It says explicitly that a generation had been gathered to their fathers. Another generation arose after them who did not know the Lord, nor the work which he had done for Israel. It's from that point that Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served false lords, right? They were serving the Ashereth and the Baal, and they're expanding outward. They're moving away from the Lord, right? Now imagine what it would be like if you had, well, let's just go back. There's an experiment that was done on, I believe it was chimpanzees. It might have been a different type of primate, but I believe it was chimpanzees, where there was a prop up at the top of a ladder where there's some sort of food, whether it be a banana or some fruit or something that is there that they want, right? There's a motivator and it's at the top. And what would happen is as soon as one of the primates would begin to climb the ladder, they would spray it with the hose, and the other apes as well. And so everybody got the effects of what that one person was doing. All the other apes began to they began to grab and pull down the other one. The one that was seeking the goal ended up being a target, right? And so they would bring them down. Eventually, they cycled out each one of those apes for a new group. And as they did, the experiment went on. And yet, from the point of time where all of the primates that were in that experiment were changed out, none of the new group had ever gotten sprayed with a hose. They had never seen the effects of why it was the case that they pulled that person, that other one down from reaching the goal. They just all did. They inherited. They forgot why that had been taking place. They inherited this problem, and they perpetuated the problem they inherited. Granted, these are animals. The point remains, when humans do this without cause, we perpetuate things that happen, and it's often because we forget what was before it, right? We forget.
It's exactly what happens in the beginning of Exodus. Is Egypt forgot Joseph and forgot the God of Joseph, and so it goes terribly. Then we get into the land, and they've got a couple of generations, and they have forgotten the God of their ancestors. Bingo. And it goes terribly. It's like, yeah.
And that's why storytelling is so important. That's the function of storytelling, to re-educate every generation in the story of who they are and who they belong to. So like in Deuteronomy, he's re-educating the next generation. Now, he doesn't say, way back when your fathers did this, he said, I made that covenant with you, meaning the people he's talking to who are the next generation. And they're probably sitting there going, wait, I wasn't there. Oh, no, you were. You were a part of those people, because they're all part of the same body in the spiritual sense. So that is why it's so important that the stories we tell ourselves matter immensely. One of the other types of therapy I do is narrative therapy or logotherapy, where we try to rewrite the story of what has happened to us from a totally different perspective. Now, it's not changing details. It's just changing the way in which those details get arranged and understood. I mean, like I've seen this happen. Oh, well, okay. I hope this is not a spoiler. You guys have all watched The Sixth Sense, right?
Yes.
Amber?
I don't know that I have, but I don't know that I
Okay.
would. So I
Okay. I'm not going to
spoil away.
spoil
Spoil away.
anything. If you know, you know. But yeah, like that's an example, or like, you know, The Usual Suspects, or I mean, there's probably 100 different examples that I can't think of off the top of my, or like, you know, any of the Knives Out movies, or, you know, anything like that, where just once you get to the end and you go, okay, this is the missing piece to the puzzle. Yes. You go back and you reread and retell the story, and you rewatch the story, and it looks and feels totally different. I remember Memento with Christopher Nolan. If you've ever been aware of that movie, that is a movie told backwards, or at least backwards with flash forwards. It plays a lot with timelines. And the same thing happens when you try to like watch that in sequence. Anyway, all that to say, the narrative that frames these details of the story matter immensely to what those details mean within the story. And that is exactly the way in which we have to read the hard parts of the Bible. We cannot extract one little chunk and say, okay, slavery here, let me pull that out and see it outside of the narrative. Joshua and the conquest here, let me pluck that out and see it outside of the narrative. Let's see, Judges and this horrific story of the Levite and his concubine. Let me pluck that out and see it outside of the narrative. Because then you miss the whole point that is being told of saying, Israel, the people of God, who he trained to be his sons, are turning into Egypt. Egypt forgot God, and they're forgetting God. And this is a spiraling descent into madness and evil and wickedness. And none of this is the way it was supposed to be.
So
if you guys want
what you're saying,
another
Spencer,
really
let me put this into a language that you and I could speak that might make sense, and so you can check if I'm understanding you correctly. So would you get producers who stop production halfway through and release the episodes not in order? People don't get the genius of Firefly because the story's confused.
Yes. In the chat, we were talking a little bit about Buffy. And so now we're talking about Firefly. I mean, like, I have made Buffy and Bob Newhart references today. That just describes what a Renaissance man I am. Tongue firmly in cheek as I say that. Anyway.
Back to Firefly.
Yes. Back to Firefly. Yes. Yes, exactly.
Okay.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
All right. Because I'm thinking like, this is trying to figure out and get my head around that. And I'm like, oh, Firefly. If you don't go back and do the work to unscramble and figure out what in the world's going on there with the unfinished story that was out of order, that people miss the genius of what's actually going on there. Okay. There we go. All right. Boy, this has been a really good hour and a half. So what are we taking away from all of this? Josh, I'm going to let you start. What do we take away from how do we not have theology make the Bible hard to read in all of this discussion?
One of the things that I would like to emphasize as a takeaway is God goes out of his way throughout both the Hebrew Bible as well as our New Testament to express to others that he has thoroughly given us no reason to distrust him. And trust is a huge part of what we're talking about. And so if you read the Bible and you come to a place where it doesn't make sense to you, the first line of defense you have is in fact knowing that the character of God is such that he has given you no reason not to trust him. One of the things that scripture says, and the Christ himself says, is that children have a special kind of faith or ability to trust. And children will believe you until you give them reason not to. Right? They will believe you. Even if you're full of crap, they'll believe you unless you give them a reason not to. And God has not given us a reason. Right? We see plenty of reason not to trust men. We see plenty of reason not to trust governments. We see plenty of reason not to trust organizations, political movements, media, the internet, even your friends or your neighbors. We have lots of reasons not to trust our wives or our husbands or our children or our parents. You have no reason not to trust God. He's given you no cause. And so when you read the scripture and it comes to a place where you're starting to see something and you're going, I don't really know how to deal with this. I don't know how to feel about this. If that leads to something that makes you want to confront whether or not God is questionable, it is time to reframe what it is that you're asking and ask God to illumine what it is that you're reading. And maybe it's the case that in this instance, what we're talking about is one of the greatest cases to be made for why spiritual headship and discipleship are necessary, right? Why repetition and review are absolutely crucial and necessary. Why it was that God instated something like the Shema that you would say every day to your family, to yourself, just repeat this affirmation of exactly the things that God is telling them to remember, all the things that we keep pointing out that they forgot. And that was their falling away point, was their forgetfulness. And why it is that when Christ instates a new sacrament, he says, when you remember me, do this in remembrance of me, right? I think that it has a lot to do with being able to recognize that God has offered a picture of himself that is thoroughly trustworthy. I think that's probably one of the biggest things that I want to come away with, is that even to beyond the negation of saying that I don't think Calvinism's God is trustworthy, because I don't. What I want to say is that the scriptural God is trustworthy. He is trustworthy, and he proves it, and he's evidential. He's not shy of pointing out what's gone wrong, what's gone right, what he did, what he didn't do. God takes responsibility, right? He's very trustworthy. And so I think if anything was the come away for this, is if your theology is making you question whether or not God is trustworthy, I think you might have a wrongful picture of the God that the Bible's portraying. There's a lot of reasons why the God of Reformed theology is questionable. One of them is the fact that he's very difficult to trust.
Yeah, and my thought is just intended as an add-on to that, because you talked about there's no reason to not trust the God of the Bible. And I would agree, but I would also point out, using my lovely whiteboard here.
Yay! I love the whiteboard.
Yes. This is the neurosequential hierarchy that Dr. Bruce Perry and several other figures have.
Move it
have
that way
noted.
a little bit. Your name tag is over the bottom. There you go. There we go.
Good. Okay.
Yeah, we're good.
So you're right, Josh. We don't have reason to trust to distrust the God of the Bible. But the problem is that humans, that is the last thing on the field and the first one off the field. Our reason is always the last thing to come into there. We have to start with regulation, with helping our bodies and our embodied self to regulate. In many ways, that's, again, reinforcing what you said about why repetition is so important. That helps regulation. Having familiarity and consistency and the same thing being taught over and over and being said over and over. That's why the Jesus prayer is so powerful. It grounds you. It grounds your somatic body in the spiritual world of truth. And so you before you kind of, go back to the Bible and look at commentaries and look at all the reasons why God is trustworthy, Start with regulation. Feel the trust of God. And if you don't feel that trust, if you can't feel that trust because of what has happened to you, because of who you've been taught God is, work on that first. Just start with regulating your system, regulating yourself into a space where you can get around spiritual and God things without being triggered, without being activated to distrust. And that does not start up here by telling yourself, downloading propositional truth. It starts by embodying a reality, embodying a whole different way of being. And that is what leads to us being able to relate better to God, to attach to him, to have the in the attachment world, because that is one of the other kind of modalities I utilize in the counseling space. In the attachment world, we talk about earned, secure attachment. The idea there is that whenever we have experienced trauma or some other kind of thing in our past, it does cause attachment dysregulation, attachment problems. But that is not determinative. It is not the end of the story. We can earn back secure attachment by securely attaching to figures who are trustworthy, like parent figures who do not betray us, like therapists who can give us unconditional positive regard, like spiritual fathers and mothers who walk with us on our journey and who tell us God loves us no matter what, over and over and over and over and over. And all those things build earned, secure attachment. And that's what helps us to relate to God. And once we do that, then we are well suited to be able to listen to all the reasons, hear the reasons, and understand that. And I wanted to bring that in because if anyone today is hearing this and thinking, boy, this is a lot of like highfalutin logical stuff about, the details of ancient texts. Like, honestly, what relevance does that have for us today? A ton, because this is part of what we have to do to build a new relationship with God after it's been torn apart by all the things we've been taught and all the life we've lived and all the experiences we've had. You have to start with healing the body. That's the regulate. And then healing the heart. That's the relate. And then healing the mind. That's the reason. So give yourself grace and be patient and allow, and it's okay to not, in fact, it's wise to not rush that process, to take it slow and to realize that, you know what, maybe I can't read the book of Judges or Joshua for a while. That's okay. Go back to what you do know. Go back to the parts of the Bible that do help your body regulate. Read Hosea for a while if you have to. Read, just over and over, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Like all those things, like solidify your embodied self in the reality of God's trustworthiness. And from that, you can be able to do everything you talked about, Josh.
And I think I would add to that needs to be done however you can, as much as you can, embodied, because this is where the incarnation really is the power and the engine of the story, because there is just something that, if you look at the Gospels, we don't start at the cross. We start at the manger, and we spend most of the ink in the four Gospels together in the life of Christ, walking through the life, walking through how does Christ brings salvation and healing, and how does he interact with the broken and the abusers? How does he interact with the dispossessed and the needy? How does, and having that lived experience so that we know what God is is walking with us through before we get to the Easter and all of the really the parts that people love to focus on. And I would say that even that whole journey needs to be focused on, because it is in my experience a very reformed, and I would even say low church, non-denom, like the world that I came out of. You get fixated on the cross, and I'm not saying that's not important, but if that's the first and only place you circle, you're missing 95% of the story. And it's all of it matters. All of it matters of coming down, walking and living among and maturing and guiding and leading, because he leads us into how to die, and he leads us into how to be raised again, and he leads us into how to be reunited with God the Father. That whole process is so important, that and we need to do that, should be modeled in our church, in our churches, and in our communities, because we are walking through those things together. And so that's really important, that embodied, we can sit together and pray the Jesus prayer. Or if you're not comfortable with that, Christ himself gave you a prayer. It's called the Lord's Prayer. That is also rhythmically grounding, that we say together, that helps us focus together on God. And there's so much loving provision put into the Lord's Prayer, and why we need to do communion, the Eucharist, every time we get together. Like that needs to be done together on a regular basis, because that's how we get settled into and absorb and deprogrammed from the trauma of reality of the fall, in a fallen existence that we all just are born into. How that gets this garment of misfitting skin of a fallen world that we inherit, how that gets tailored and refined and eventually stripped off, so that we don't need that anymore, because we're ready to be in the presence of an almighty, loving God who wants us back in the tabernacle with him again. So I would say, like, yes, all of that. And it really needs to be done in support and loving community together. Because that I tell you, there, so just real quickly, and then we'll be done. As I'm sitting in liturgy between two of my friends, and I'm still working through a lot of spiritual religious trauma myself, there's something so grounding just about that body doubling of having calm, healthy friends on both sides of me. They don't have to say or do anything. We don't have to interact at all, but just the fact that they're there is a calming presence, so that I can participate in the liturgy and what's going on in the service. So there's something about that grounding of presence that is really, really, really important. So as much as we can, I mean, it's a beautiful thing. So Josh, you guys got anything coming up over there in Cosmic Corner at some point here soon?
Yes, at some point here soon. Well, there was supposed to be a pre-recording an episode that happened on Saturday. It didn't line up for scheduling. In fact, ironically, it's an episode that I've been trying to reschedule since the beginning of October, and it seems like every time we try to do it, we get about a week away from doing it, and then everything happens all at once, and everybody's like, "Yeah, I don't know if this is going to line up to do it right now," but we're deeply intending to be able to come and do a part 2 of our discussion that we had on Cosmic Corner quite a while ago about the symbolism and pattern of vampires. And so that's actually what I'm intending to try to get to sooner rather than later. But also I will be collaborating coming soon here with Chris, who does the Sanctuary channel here on YouTube. We're going to be doing a part 2 to a discussion that we had on Eden as a structural basis or a model of reality in a functional sense. And so That's coming up, I think, on the 26th. I would have to check my calendar. Don't quote me on that, but check out Chris's channel. If you look up Chris Pompu, the Sanctuary on YouTube, you'll find his channel, and then check some of his content or whatever. It's on the previous episode is on there, but the new episode should be coming up pretty soon on there. So keep an eye out for that. But we will be recording the Vampires Part 2. I am way more stubborn than life has. I think it's underestimating how stubborn I am, but we will get to that. But patience will have its perfect work. That's how I'm looking at it right now. So hopefully that comes down the tube sooner rather than later, but that's pretty much the plan for right now.
I can also add a rec in for Chris Pompu. I have interviewed him on my channel. So yeah, he's great. Sorry.
So, okay, Spencer, what's coming up on my favorite channel?
Well, let's see. I can't tell you what's happening on the Nathan Jacobs podcast, but on my podcast, I am working on right now. It's about a week behind because boy, Christmas really did a number with my speech difficulties, and so I'm just taking it slow and easy, and kind of trying to not push myself too hard. But I'm working on part 2 of a episode about the law, and then from there we're going to dive into talking about both holy and common, and then also pure and impure. And of course we will always be doing that with a trauma-informed lens, and looking at things like purity culture, and also taking a look at things like, what holiness means. Is it about being good and holier than thou and all that stuff? But then what I'm also really excited about is after that, I'm going to be releasing a video or a interview that I did back in October with Mako Nagasawa. If anyone is familiar with him, he's the director of the Anastasis Center. He has a website, anastasiscenter.org, and I'm really looking forward to making that the next expertise episode that I have, where I interview somebody, because he's got some really cool things to say about anger and wrath, and how a proper understanding of the Bible, specifically Exodus and Leviticus, specifically how those things, understanding them properly, deeply affects not just how we view God, but how we interact in the world, and how we handle our anger, and how we handle our emotions. So there's some really good stuff there, and I'm really excited about that conversation.
Well, we need Leviticus to get to how awesome Ezekiel is. So, we put up with Leviticus because it gives a awesome punch to the book of Ezekiel. So we've got a couple things coming up around here. On the 20th, I think. I got 2 coming up in like 2 days. So on the 20th and the 22nd, one of them, Spencer's coming back, and Phil Bray is going to join us, and we're going to talk about garment of skin. And I'm very excited about this conversation because it is going to, blow some minds, because it really is not what you think it is at all. And then the other one, Phil Bray is coming back, and he and I are going to talk about food and feasting in the Old Testament. And like what? So I'm very excited about both of those conversations, because anytime I get to nerd out in the Old Testament with my favorite Old Testament nerd friends, it's always fun. So I'm always very grateful for both of them, who give generously of their time to help me unpack all of this really cool stuff on my channel. So thank you very much, Josh and Spencer. This was amazing. It was a great conversation. I really, like I said, I don't normally like to go after things. I like to always focus on the positive and the power and the positive power of the narrative. But it just is become, for me, because you've got so many people coming out now in these younger generations, and kids like my daughter's age who are unchurched, who don't have a lot of the baggage that so many of us grew up with, and they're walking into this in a completely different framework and not getting sucked into some of this stealth stuff that is going to re-damage where we've already tried to recover from. Like I just don't, that was just doesn't sit well with me. So we're going to not do that anymore. So, but thank you all so much for spending the last 2 hours with us. This was great fun, and hopefully we'll see you back again when Spencer is back for the Garments of Skin coming up here in a couple of weeks. Thank you so much, and don't forget, we are trying around here to wake up to the mystery of how beautiful Scripture is. Go and be blessed.